everyone, and welcome again to Books in the World, a production of the Cape Cod Writers Center. Today we have Christie Lowrance. Hello, Christie. How are you? Nice to see you.
You as well. Thank you.
We're going to talk about Nature's Ambassador, the Legacy of Thornton Burgess. And Thornton Burgess is such a legend and a beloved person to us Cape Codders, and maybe many of us think we know so much about him, and we maybe know a lot, but not as much as there is to know. What a man. What a man. I really enjoyed the book. Congratulations on the fine job. Really fine job. Just before we start getting into it, I just want to mention that your background, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing, teaching, writing. You have a writer, you just write a lot.
Writers do write a lot, for sure. And I've been at it for quite a long time. Actually, I say 30 years. It's more than that, but you know, the numbers start.
That's good enough.
That's good enough, right?
Yes, definitely.
But freelance writers find themselves of necessity doing all different kinds of things. And so I've written for a software company and advertising agencies, and for Cape Cod Times, magazines, national magazines, and learning, learning every step of the way. Well,
I want to remind everyone, as always, there is a website, ChristieLowrance.com, and Christie has a blog. And on her website, she has an incredible list of topics that she's covered. And she has also written poetry, and you've got your hand in just about everything. Speaking of the internet, if you're interested in this book, which I'm positive you will be before we finish talking about it, there are links on Christie's website to interviews with Mindy Todd from NPR, the Point program. The Cape Cod Times interview with Melanie Lowries is very comprehensive about the details of Thornton Burgess's life. We're going to cover some of that today, but we're also going to talk about some of the topics relating to the literary style, his personal, let's say, moral position that he was coming from, what his effect was on children, and then also his tremendous influence and involvement in the conservation movement. So just to set the scene, we are talking about the period 1874 to 1965. Those are his birth and death dates. And when you stop and think of what was going on in 1874 in Sandwich and what it was like, and then all the things that happened in that time period, you know, he traversed eras of all kinds of developments. It's very interesting that he was a turn of the century person, I guess, is what I kind of feel about him.
Yeah. I had to decide where, as every author does, where the book was going to start. And that span of years that you've identified was the starting place to point out that 9 years after the Civil War he was born, and I came across a letter that he wrote to a Canadian friend about the assassination of President Kennedy. So we have Lincoln's assassination and Kennedy's assassination. Yeah, so it really is, as you point out, it's quite remarkable.
Remarkable. Just in case anyone doesn't know the Thornton Burgess that we are talking about, I just want to make sure that we know that he's famous for Old Mother West Wind and 70 full-scale children's books that used animals to convey a world of nature, morality, excitement, and they were written for children. But he also wrote 15,000 syndicated newspaper columns or so. And the other detail I find, since I am a librarian and have been in publishing, I always look at things like that. 7,500,000 copies of his books have been in print, have physically been in the world.
Right. And more.
And more.
Undoubtedly more.
Yeah.
In the book, I had to establish something, but it was extremely difficult to determine any kind of an accurate number of the books sold. And that 7.5 million by mid-20th century was reasonable, but there were newspaper articles that cited 11 million books by around 1965.
Wow.
So the potential is there, and why the variation, you know, you don't know for sure.
Well, it doesn't matter. 7 million or 11 million. It's a lot of a lot of physical books bought by parents, probably read to their children,
and by libraries.
And by libraries.
Read by many children.
Many children in the libraries. I just want to quote a couple of the reviews that set the stage for how much work you did and what kind of a varied life this man had. This one says, first of all, you have 5-star reviews on Amazon, 5-star reviews on Barnes and Nobles. In her impeccably researched and organized biography, Miss Lowrance gives us not only the complete life of Burgess, but the times and the connections, and we see him brand new as naturalist, environmentalist, conservationist, teacher, son, husband, father, grandfather, and the amazing children's writer he was. This will remain the definitive Thornton Burgess volume for years to come, for scholars, naturalists, environmentalists, educators, and of course for us, Thornton Burgess fans everywhere. And this is something we're going to get to next, A Forgotten Conservationist, a fascinating book that recovers Burgess's role as an important 20th century conservationist, from his Nature Club radio hour to his filming the last sighting of the now extinct heath hen. But he was both a pioneer and an iconic citizen conservationist. We have other nice, wonderful things that people have said about the book, but just let's start by my asking you what inspired you to undertake this project.
Well, sort of like Thornton Burgess, it was a project that was suggested, and freelance writers are always looking for something, you know, a good project of merit that seems, you know, commercially viable. So I pursued this, wrote a book proposal. Schiffer Publishing accepted it, and so it began that way with and I had written a number of articles about Thornton Burgess and the Burgess Society as a freelance writer. So I had interviewed a number of people, and in the writing of this book, beginning in 2009, I had access to those interviews from the 1980s, and in fact had interviewed Thornton Burgess's secretary in 1988. And since writers never throw anything away, you know, I had all that information to draw on.
I was amused and bemused by the fact that you live in Thornton Burgess's house, or the house that he was born in.
Right.
And would you use that point as a springboard to talking about his life in Sandwich, those early years, and some of the details about what's still there in Sandwich?
There was a reviewer who commented on Thornton Burgess's drawing, relating this very idyllic and fantasy world, and I had to laugh because the Thornton Burgess, the Sandwich that he knew, is still there, you know, and very much so. It's still, you know, to a great extent, a quiet village. But in my house, it really is. I don't know. It was. Wasn't like there were ghosts or anything around. You know, people have asked that, and no. But there was very much an understanding that the house, which he did not live in for a long time because his father died when he was less than a year old, and he and his mother moved, but still that environment, I can look out my office window to across the street, the vacant lot where his elementary school was. And right next to it, in a vacant space, was the casino, which is where he gave a talk in, I think it was 37 for a celebration of the town, and he was the guest of honor. So there he was, you know, I can fantasize, I can kind of picture him there. And at the end of School Street, there was the lake house next to the Hoxie House, if you know Sandwich.
Yeah.
And that's where he and his mother lived when he was a senior in high school. And I paced it, the time it took me to walk from Liberty Street, where one of the houses that they lived in was located, down along Main Street to the Village Inn, which is now owned by Chris Wilson and operated as an inn. But he lived in that house. And in a very short space of time, I walked past 5 houses, different houses. But when you live in Sandwich, when you know the Burgess story, it's very easy to say, oh yes, he lived in 10 houses, and then just move on. But in writing the biography, I had occasion to think about the impact on a child of that, of having moved so much and never, ever having your own room, never, ever having your own house. And I think this environment in Sandwich, in growing up in the midst of this large family and of necessity, having to earn money by picking cranberries and blueberries and shoveling snow, and he recounts this, and I recount in the book the things that he did to earn money as a boy. So I think that childhood in Sandwich was extremely formative, and without that background in the book, you really wouldn't understand fully who he was.
I loved making the connection, as you did, between the fact that he spent a lot of time doing chores and being out in nature and collecting various things that he could then sell or collect or use, firewood or whatever. There's a wonderful story about how he got caught in a thunderstorm out on a marsh, I believe. And then you connect that with the fact that he had all these different family members that he moved from house to house. There was a degree of gossip, and people would all be talking about what was going on with this one or that one, and all of this was very supportive. But then he translates it at some point when he starts writing these stories for his son into these little animals who have this kind of lifestyle that is reminiscent of his childhood.
Right.
That I think that's very charming, and the connection is very nice. Just in case we don't get to this, I do want to tell everybody this is an absolutely gorgeous book. There are pages of illustrations of these characters that were created for the book. So just hold up one, and so that you can see this. This is one of his original. This
one
is
of Harrison Cady's.
Harrison Cady is the illustrator, and it is also a full-fledged biography in that any and every picture that you could find is here. So you can see the people in his life, the various stages of his life, the various professions that he had, the causes that he was involved in, and it is all very, very well put together. We have a lot to cover, and I just want to make a comment here that we've talked about halfway through our time together, so we can I think what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about children's literature and some of the topics we talked about before, and then jump into the impact he had on the naturalist movement, so we can sort of divide up our time a little bit that way. One of the things that, well, first of all, quickly, Thornton Burgess wrote these stories for his son, and that was how he got started.
Right. He was a journalist for 16 years before.
Right.
So writing was natural to him.
He was a writer.
But he hadn't been writing stories until, as you say, he wrote those for his children,
yeah,
for his son.
And it's hard not to digress, the fact that he had lost his wife, and that the child was very young at that, just born. And
he was about 3 when Thornton Burgess wrote those stories, and he was away from home, so he wrote them and mailed them to his son every day to comfort him.
That was very sweet. And the fact that Thornton Burgess had lost his father, I mean, the parallel there was very touching as well. But at the time, he used these stories to send messages to his son, and he had these little moral lessons. And how long did it take until this became part of children's literature, which was very new at the time? People were not writing specifically for children. He was one of the earliest people who did that.
He was. It was a time when publishers were encouraging writers to pump out as many books as possible. And Little Brown had showed an interest in looking at his stories and then said, yep, we'd like to put together a book. We need a few more chapters. He provided those. And they sold about 2,000 copies in the first year. The next year, Little Brown asked for a second book. And then he really felt validated as a children's writer with that request for a second book. And I don't remember exactly the year, but 1914, 1915, he had multiple books every year. And his acceptance, I think, was rapid for a couple reasons. He had been a journalist, as I said, so he was known in a certain area. But he was also lecturing and utilizing that as a way to promote. He was very savvy about cross marketing.
Yeah.
And so so the lectures also gave him some prominence. And then coming into the 20s, he had his radio program. But by the 20s, he was extremely well known. In 1919, he was honored by the New York Zoological Society with a Gold Medal Award for his influence on children. And so certainly within less than a decade, he was nationally known.
You mentioned that he had a radio program. He was very up to date and using marketing means, I guess we would call them today. It's just like jumping on having a Facebook page. He had a radio program for children, which I think was very nice. Just quickly, would you mention Peter Rabbit and the fact that some people think Peter Rabbit is Thornton Burgess's creation, and some people don't because they think it's Beatrix Potter's creation.
Well, it certainly is a piece of controversy, and it's seen in different ways. I've highlighted using literary children's library science authority Margaret Bush and David Mitchell with New York University to identify the different stances. One is that the use of Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit character, which was first published in 1901, the use of that 9 years later in 1910 was a matter of usurping, plagiarizing, if you will, or was it a matter of simply common practice? The field of children's literature was new. There was a lot of borrowing. In fact, I believe David Mitchell sent me an instance of somebody plagiarizing Thornton Burgess's characters a few years later, using them. So in those early decades in the 1900s, the standards were they weren't there. In the book, I point out, if I can find this.
I think I'm remembering something. You might find it before I get this thought across. But that I think it was Margaret Bush, who was authority, said that today publishers wouldn't have let it happen. That Peter became the name of a rabbit, whether you knew Beatrix Potter or you didn't. Peter, if you had a rabbit, it was Peter. So it's sort of like I don't know, Bambi as a deer, I suppose would be a similar thing. If you wrote a book about a deer, you might want to call it Bambi, even though, and if no publisher was looking over your shoulder, you might just go ahead and do that.
Right, and I think that was more common then. There were instances of wrens being referred to, they were Jenny Wren. It's kind of like, you know, Smokey the Bear, where a species takes on a name. And I think that was a significant influence at the time, but it's, you know, it's seen in two different ways. But I laid out the chronology of publication and the issues in the book. So, you know, people can take a look at it. Yeah,
at least it's all there.
It's there.
And as you said, we were talking about the process of discovery of all the various things that you came upon that you didn't expect to find, which led to the book having several distinct parts, and the part about his effect on the natural world, the conservation movement, is probably completely unique to this book, the fact that you put all of this together.
There has been a memoir of Thornton Burgess and his own autobiography, and a couple others. There's an excellent bibliography by Wayne Wright. But in terms of the fuller story, which includes the conservation story, that's the one that's deeper. It's not right on the surface. The children's books were, that's known, that's accessible, but to trace the impact on conservation required some digging, and the letters that I got from the Smithsonian Institution and Bowdoin College and the University of New Brunswick went a long way, I think, to establishing the solidness of his contribution.
Would you like to go to that comment by Chuck Roth from the Massachusetts Audubon Society that we were talking about earlier, that really set the stage? It's part of the introduction to the book.
Right. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Chuck Roth is very well known in Mass Audubon circles, and in two naturalists and natural scientists. And in the book I say that he knew Burgess personally and lauds his contributions to the early conservation movement as well as to children's literature. Quote, "John Muir was one voice, John Burroughs was another, and Thornton Burgess was another," says Roth. "I think they were all bringing the same message through different routes to the public at large, but Burgess had the widest audience." And this is, I think, an extremely important point. He goes on, "They all wrote well-accepted books, but Burgess was in newspapers all over the country, day in and day out, albeit with a different audience. He realized that his books and stories were going to be read by adults as well as kids, and he always had a subtle message for them." And that ability that Thornton Burgess had to reach the public, to access public opinion, and his credibility with the public made him valuable to people like William Hornaday, who was a conservation activist, wildlife advocate. And he recognized very well, Hornaday did, that his cause for passing the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, for example, in the 19-teens, was going to be aided by Thornton Burgess's advocacy. And Thornton Burgess wrote his book, Poor Mrs. Quack, specifically to help William Hornaday's cause.
It's really interesting how these things meshed so nicely, really.
But I think there's a subtlety in this story, and I'll be very interested to hear how it's perceived. The subtlety is that a children's writer had this kind of impact, using children's literature to influence the environmental values, the sensibilities of children.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's a good point. So tell us about some of the things he did with establishing wildlife sanctuaries or bird sanctuaries. What was that about?
He had he was writing for People's Home Journal in, I think he started around 1914, and he had this idea to develop the Green Meadow Club. And it was a time when being a member of something was extremely attractive to children. And the Green Meadow Clubs just took off. There were, I think, was it St. Louis had something like 50,000, or was it more? my memory of the figures, unfortunately, but it was tremendous number.
Children belonged to this
these
club.
clubs.
What did
Right.
they do as members?
They, first of all, they had to pledge that they would be kind to wildlife.
Okay.
And so that's what I mean about his influence on values.
Yeah.
To take part, you had to think about how you were going to interact with wildlife.
Yeah.
And so these clubs were tremendously popular, and he came up with this idea of, well, let's establish bird sanctuaries, and on private land, let's put out this challenge to the readers of the People's Home Journal, children and adults. Let's challenge them with coming up with 5 million acres of private land that will be posted for birds, that birds will be protected, there'll be no hunting here, that bird houses will perhaps be put up, the feed will be put out.
Are any of these still protected areas? Are they?
I don't know. That's the thing. That's a subtlety about this, because as I point out in the book, there was no regulation of this.
Okay.
But statistics were kept very carefully, and awards were made, so people were honored, for the numbers that they had.
That's a charming story.
It is a charming story.
There's so much charming information here, and the more you think about him and his impact and the stories that he told, it is a lovely story. I hope that people will buy the book. I'm sure every bookstore on the Cape has it. Ask for it at your libraries. I know you're going to be surprised for me to tell you that we're out of time. So
oh no! Oh, good heavens!
Wrapping up here, we should take another half hour to go back over everything we didn't discuss. But please, everyone, do try to ask your libraries and bookstores for this book. It's really a pleasure. One of the reviewers talks, one of the people who comment on the internet talks about wanting to give this to his children to get them away from their iPods just temporarily. So maybe we can create a Thornton Burgess revival. Thank you so much, and we'll talk some more. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.